Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how to use salt with watercolor. We're going to chart two different types of salt on different paint consistencies and see the results and how they compare. And then we're also going to do two different watercolor projects using salt so that you can see how to apply this technique in real life. But first, how does salt work with watercolor? Why does it make very interesting textures? Well, the salt absorbs the water and the pigment while also pushing it away, making very cool, fluffy, kind of crystal-like textures on the paper. The two types of salt that we are going to be using today are fine granulated table salt and thick, coarse kosher salt. For the chart that we are making for these salt experiments, I am sectioning my paper off into two sides, and on the left side is going to be for the coarse salt experiments, and the right side is going to be for the fine salt experiments. So for this first paint swatch, I am doing a very highly pigmented, very little water, and putting salt kind of slowly onto the paint. So I wanted to see what will happen if I let the paint dry for a second, and then I put the salt on each of those, and I'm going to label them high pigment. Now, I'm not going to label the other ones until the end, so just bear with me as I tell you. You can remember, but this next section is more of the medium wash, a more typical wash that you do most commonly, and it's pretty much equal water and pigment. The kosher salt is on the left side, and the fine salt is on the right side. The next one is very low pigment and high water. Because salt reacts so much with water by absorbing it, having more liquid in your consistencies is going to have a much different effect than a higher pigment wash. On this one, I went back to the medium pigment wash, but I wanted the right side of just this one swatch to be really highly concentrated with the salt, and then doing a little bit of salt, a very scant amount of salt on the left side. So this is with the fine salt, and then I copied that same thing with the coarse salt, where I'm just very heavy with the salt on the right side of the line, and then just doing a little bit on the left side, just to be able to compare the difference in the amount of salt used. And if you were wondering, this is how I very carefully remove the salt before painting the next line. For this one, I wanted to do another high pigment concentration, but place the salt immediately. So I did these one at a time so that I could very quickly place the salt and see if it made that much of a difference compared to the first lines that we painted. On this last paint sample, I thought it would be fun to see what both salt types would look like together. And so again, I did another medium wash where it was about 50-50 water and pigment, which seems to be the most common type of wash that I use. And I placed the coarse salt first, and then kind of sprinkled in just little sections the finer salt, just to see if that would create a new or interesting pattern because of the sizes of the salt. Now, all of my little experiments are labeled, but my biggest tip for you is to make sure that the salt and the painting is totally dry before you remove it. Because the salt holds onto some of the pigment and water, you can get streaks across your painting if the salt is not dry when you try to take it off. I also had to use this little nail tool to get some of my salt off because it kind of got stuck. Here is what it looks like, totally dry with the salt removed. I thought it was really interesting how certain areas, when it was clustered together, looked pretty much the same. Even when they're separated apart, they really don't have too much of a difference, which is good news, I guess, because salt is salt and you can use whatever you have on hand. And I think the biggest takeaway is consistencies and water. How much pigment you have versus how much water you have, that will really change the look and effect of your salt and the texture on the paper. Now I'm going to show you how you can take what you've learned with salt and watercolor and apply it to real watercolor projects. So for this first project, I wanted to create a snowy forest landscape. And so I started with a bluish purple, very gray, equal pigment to water ratio. And then I dropped coarse salt and fine salt across the paper. And while that dries, I'm going to start on the second project, which is going to be a dandelion that's kind of being blown in the wind. And so I did a green mid-tone wash of watercolor, and then I did my coarse salt and fine salt in a circle, making sure to do some salt over in the upper right hand corner as the little pieces of the dandelion are being blown into the wind, and that will kind of be more clear as it dries. So here is what they both look like with the salt still on the paper, but the paper is totally dry. I'm going to remove the salt from the piece, and this is what they look like with the salt removed. So maybe you can kind of see the vision of how everything's going to turn out, but we are going to finish with the snowy project first. For this piece, I'm thinking of a very misty, kind of hard to see landscape because it's really snowing, there's a blizzard or something like that. So that's why I've got all that beautiful texture in the background. So these trees here are far in the distance, and I wanted to show how you could do a light tree line and then dab at it with paper towel. So you will see in this example, I dab the paper towel 100 times. But what happens is you can do really hard lines, dab a paper towel, and it gives that really nice, soft, misty look. And if anything looks too hard or crisp, you just dab at it with the paper towel, and you can add fine lines in certain areas to give crisp and soft edges so that it looks as if there's snow blowing all over. So these trees here on the left side are a lot closer to us visually, and so they're going to be darker because we can see them a lot clearer, but they're still going to have that misty, snowy feeling, so I'm continuing to use the paper towel. And then I'm just slanting these trees over here to the left just to give motion to the painting, as if the trees in the background are on one hill and the trees closer to us are on another hill. And I also added some green to this wash to give it more of a closer feel so that we can start seeing the green in the trees. Again, using that paper towel a lot and just being really thin and deliberate with the lines. And when I paint a snowy piece, while it's still a little bit wet, I like to go in and splatter some white. This gives another great snowy effect that adds to the texture we already have in the background. All right, now we are going to finish the dandelion project, and the most important part of the stem is to make sure it's coming at the dandelion in the right angle. So I like to start with that first so that I can get a good visual of the direction that my dandelion is kind of swaying in the wind, and those little pieces are coming off up on the right side. So I've got the stem there, and then now I am adding in a circle the little ends of those dandelion seeds that come off. And they're dark brown, so I kept it really simple, really straight, short lines all the way around and kept them dark brown. And then now the fun part is adding those long lines with the little seed pod things at the bottom of the dandelion as they're blowing off into the wind. And so to represent that on the main part of the dandelion, the ones that are still there, I'm just doing really, really thin, light lines because you really don't want to overwhelm this dandelion. The lines of those little pods that come off really aren't very visually dark. And so I just kept my lines really light and thin and just made the pieces that have come off more distinct so that we can tell what is happening. So this gives a lot of movement to the painting, but also keeping it really simple. And then I went through and added a kind of a yellowish green little dots around, and I felt like this grounded each of those lines to a dandelion fluff. So I love the way that this texture really made it look nice and fluffy like a dandelion. So that is it. Both of our projects completed using the techniques that we learned with salt and watercolor. Also, I hope you really try out some more experiments on your own with salt and watercolor, playing around with consistencies. It's very fun. Then you can have your own chart to keep on your desk as well. Thank you so much for being here today, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.